In old Hollywood, image was everything. Romance was scripted, marriages were marketed, and being single could be considered a flaw. Yet some actors refused to play the game. Behind the glamour and public appearances were stars who never said "I do." In this video, we reveal 23 Golden Age actors who never married, and the emotional, professional, and deeply personal reasons why. Their solitude became their signature, and sometimes their silent tragedy. Cesar Romero. Cesar Romero had everything studios loved. Matinee idol looks, a magnetic smile, and elegance that lit up the screen. Best remembered for his flamboyant Joker in the 1960s Batman TV series and suave roles in 1930s to 40s cinema, Romero became known not just for his performances, but for his bachelorhood. He never married, and that mystery only amplified his intrigue. Romero maintained a lifelong public image as a ladies' man, but in private, he was widely believed to be gay. At a time when homosexuality could destroy a career, Romero played the role expected of him: charming, flirty, unattached, but never confirmed anything. He lived with his mother for most of his life, and while he never openly discussed his sexuality, insiders later revealed long-term same-sex relationships quietly sustained behind studio walls. Not getting married may have given Romero personal freedom, but it came at a cost. He was often cast in supporting or comedic roles rather than leading romantic ones, especially in his later years. Hollywood had no space for an unmarried leading man unless he had a fabricated public romance. His refusal to fake one kept him locked out of some of the era's biggest romantic scripts. Romero wore his bachelor status with grace and humor, once joking, "I was never able to wed because I never found a woman who could cook like my mother." In truth, his unmarried life was a quiet rebellion, a life lived on his own terms, in an industry that demanded mass. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was one of Hollywood's most sensitive and mesmerizing stars, with performances in From Here to Eternity, A Place in the Sun, and Judgment at Nuremberg cementing his place among cinema's elite. Yet behind those soulful eyes was a man tormented by inner conflict, and he never married. Clift was a deeply private individual who battled insecurities, addiction, and emotional wounds. Though he had intimate relationships with both men and women, his closest bond was arguably with Elizabeth Taylor, who once called him her soulmate. Still, even she couldn't draw him into matrimony. Many who knew him said Clift longed for love, but didn't believe he deserved it. The 1956 car crash that shattered his face also shattered his confidence. Clift spiraled into painkiller addiction and depression, pushing away even those who tried to help. His bachelorhood wasn't always a choice. It was in many ways a symptom of a life consumed by emotional battles. In a town where romantic leading men were expected to marry, or at least pretend, Clift's single status created distance between him and the press. Studios struggled to fit him into their PR machines. Still, his unmatched vulnerability on screen made him unforgettable. Montgomery Clift's unmarried life wasn't about rebellion or image. It was a quiet sorrow. He died alone at just 45, leaving behind performances that still ache with truth. His bachelorhood mirrored his brilliance, raw, tragic, and defiantly real. Sal Mineo. Sal Mineo became a teen idol overnight after his haunting portrayal of Plato in Rebel Without a Cause. With brooding eyes and a restless soul, he captivated a generation. But Mineo's personal life was a far cry from the adoration he received. He never married, and unlike many of his peers, he never even attempted a fake romance for the cameras. Mineo was gay at a time when Hollywood wouldn't tolerate it. Though he kept his sexuality private in public, he was out among trusted friends. But his refusal to play the studio game cost him dearly. After being typecast as the troubled youth, Mineo found roles drying up. His career stalled, and the whispers about his sexuality grew louder. He never married not out of disinterest, but because the world wouldn't let him live freely. Relationships remained hidden. Love was lived in shadows. He later returned to stage work and was rebuilding his career when he was tragically stabbed to death at age 37. Sal Mineo's bachelorhood was not just a personal reality, it was an indictment of an industry that punished those who didn't conform. In the end, he died without ever being allowed to live fully. Clifton Webb. Clifton Webb brought a rare sophistication to comedy with his roles in Laura, Sitting Pretty, and Cheaper by the Dozen. He was witty, poised, and unforgettable, but also completely unmarried. Webb never had a public relationship and famously lived with his mother until her death. Webb was gay, but he never publicly acknowledged it. He saw no need to explain his private life. Friends described him as intellectual, deeply cultured, and obsessively loyal to his mother. It wasn't that he hated marriage. He simply rejected the world's need to define his personal worth through it. His bachelorhood became part of his mystique. He was often cast as the snide, clever outsider, the unmarried man with too many opinions and too much polish. And audiences loved it. By never marrying, Webb preserved an authenticity rare in Hollywood. He didn't fake romances or bend to studio pressure, and that defiance may have kept him from traditional leading roles, but it made him an icon to those who saw through the studio system's illusions. Edward Everett Horton. Edward Everett Horton, the charmingly flustered comic relief in dozens of 1930s and 1940s classics, was a staple of Golden Age films. He worked alongside everyone from Fred Astaire to Katharine Hepburn, delivering humor with a flutter and a stammer that became his trademark. But behind the laughter was a man who remained forever alone. Horton never married, though in interviews he often quipped that he was still taking applications. His bachelorhood was often played for laughs, but insiders knew it ran deeper. He was rumored to be gay, but like many of his time, he never confirmed it publicly. Despite his prolific career, Horton's roles were largely confined to side characters. Some say his unmarried status typecast him as the comedic uncle, never the romantic lead. He worked steadily, but never with the spotlight afforded to more conventional stars. His long life was spent in comfortable solitude, and he left behind a legacy of joyful moments on screen. For Horton, bachelorhood wasn't a tragedy, it was a lifestyle. But in Hollywood's rigid world, it also meant a permanent supporting role. Richard Deacon. Richard Deacon was never the star, but he was the face you instantly recognized. From The Dick Van Dyke Show to countless film roles, Deacon played the neurotic neighbor, the uptight boss, or the perpetually exasperated authority figure. Yet while audiences laughed at his timing, few knew the man behind the glasses, and quick wit remained entirely unmarried. Deacon never married and rarely spoke about his personal life. Industry insiders whispered that he was gay, though he never publicly acknowledged it. In an era when being out could end a career overnight, Deacon chose silence over scandal. His bachelorhood was explained away by fans as eccentricity, but to him it was self-preservation. While he was never a leading man, Deacon became indispensable as a character actor. Still, his lack of a public personal life meant he was never marketed or celebrated the way his co-stars were. He was reliable, consistent, professional, and invisible beyond the screen. Deacon's unmarried life meant he lived on his own terms, but it also likely cost him greater recognition. He wasn't alone. He was hidden, and in the carefully crafted world of old Hollywood, that was perhaps the greatest sacrifice. Sterling Holloway. You may not know his face, but you've definitely heard his voice. Sterling Holloway was the gentle tone behind Disney legends like Winnie the Pooh, Kaa the Snake, and the Cheshire Cat. A master of whimsy and innocence, Holloway was a beloved figure in voice acting, but behind his playful charm was a man who never found, or sought, matrimony. Holloway never married, and friends described him as someone entirely content in solitude. He was reportedly asexual or simply uninterested in romantic entanglements. Instead, his energy went into his craft, performing, traveling, and pursuing artistic satisfaction. While his bachelorhood never stirred tabloid scandals, it did keep him somewhat peripheral to Hollywood's inner social circles. Stars who dated, married, and divorced in the public eye stayed in the headlines. Holloway stayed in the recording booth. Some argued he was overlooked because of it, but perhaps his greatest love was his work, and that devotion made him immortal. His voice remains cherished by generations of children, long after many of his peers have been forgotten. For Sterling Holloway, bachelorhood wasn't a mystery, it was clarity. Victor Buono. Victor Buono made a big impression, literally and figuratively. With his large frame and booming voice, he was unforgettable in roles like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and Batman. But beyond the camp and villainy was a thoughtful man with a poet's soul and a confirmed lifelong bachelor. Buono never married and was openly skeptical of romance. He once joked in a television interview, "I live like a bachelor because I can't find a man or a woman who will have me." That joke wasn't just a line, it was a subtle nod to his private reality as a gay man in Hollywood. His size, sexuality, and singular personality kept him from leading roles, but also gave him a unique niche. Still, there was a loneliness that seemed to follow him, a sense that Buono knew he'd never be fully accepted by the world that employed him. Buono's bachelorhood was an extension of his uniqueness. He didn't fit any mold, and that made him unforgettable. But it also made him a solitary figure in a town built on connection and illusion. Frank Morgan. To generations, Frank Morgan will always be the Wizard of Oz. But while his character granted others their deepest wishes, Morgan himself never sought or accepted the trappings of traditional life. He never married and lived a life of eccentric solitude. Morgan was known for his love of fine clothes, cigars, and scotch. He was a fixture of Hollywood society, but kept personal intimacy at arm's length. Some say he feared commitment, others that he simply enjoyed his freedom too much to share it. His bachelorhood lent him an air of mystery and refinement that translated perfectly to screen. But it also made him harder to market in a time when public interest in romantic lives drove popularity. While Morgan never lacked work, he often played oddballs or whimsical figures, never the family man or romantic lead. In a town obsessed with image, Frank Morgan's refusal to settle down made him a riddle. And perhaps that's why, decades later, we still wonder who he truly was, behind the curtain. Paul Lynde. Paul Lynde was a comic genius. His biting wit and snarky voice became a staple of mid-century television and stage. Known for Bewitched in Hollywood squares, Lynde lit up screens with laughter, but lived a deeply private and often painful life. He never married, and his bachelorhood became a source of both curiosity and ridicule. Lynde was gay but remained closeted throughout his career. His sexuality was an open secret in Hollywood, but one he could never publicly own. Studios feared backlash, and Lynde himself struggled with self-acceptance. Instead of love, he poured himself into humor, sometimes caustic, always brilliant. His bachelorhood wasn't a quirky personal trait, it was a protective shield. While it allowed him to continue working, it also confined him to caricatures. Never the romantic lead, always the campy sidekick. Paul Lynde's unmarried life reflected the emotional toll of fame without authenticity. He made millions laugh, yet few knew the sorrow behind the sarcasm. His was a life of performance, on and off screen, and bachelorhood became part of the act. Eric Rhodes. Eric Rhodes was the epitome of elegance in 1930s musicals, often playing the foreign aristocrat with perfect comedic timing. He appeared in several Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers classics, such as The Gay Divorcee and Top Hat, where his charm lit up the screen. But while he portrayed lovers and aristocrats off-screen, Rhodes lived an entirely different story. He never married and rarely even mentioned his private life. Born Ernest Sharp, Rhodes was well known in Broadway circles and maintained close friendships within the theater and film communities. His sexuality was never publicly confirmed, but many contemporaries believed he was gay. In a time when actors were under constant pressure to conform to heterosexual norms, Rhodes quietly avoided the topic altogether. Instead, he focused on his craft, moving seamlessly between stage and screen. His refusal to marry or publicly pair up with a woman meant he was never promoted as a leading man in the romantic sense. Studios couldn't figure out how to market him beyond quirky side roles, especially with his distinct voice and continental flair. As a result, while his performances were praised, his film career plateaued quickly compared to peers who leaned into the studio publicity machine. Rhodes later returned to the stage, where he found more creative freedom and less pressure to maintain a fictional, personal life. He continued working steadily and lived comfortably, but his legacy faded into obscurity as Hollywood forgot those who didn't fit its mold. His bachelorhood wasn't loud or defiant, it was quiet resistance. Eric Rhodes lived life on his own terms. even if it meant staying just outside the spotlight. In the end, his story reminds us that for many actors, bachelorhood wasn't about loneliness. It was about survival in an industry that didn't accept who they truly were. Misha Auer. Misha Auer was unforgettable. Tall, thin, eccentric, and with a comedic flair that stole every scene. Nominated for an Academy Award for My Man Godfrey, Auer was one of the first actors to blend European sophistication with screwball humor. But while his characters often pined for love, the real Auer never settled down. Despite multiple rumored engagements, he never actually married. Born into Russian nobility, Auer fled political upheaval and began acting to survive. His real life was already dramatic enough, and he preferred to keep his personal affairs out of the gossip columns. Though charming and known for his offbeat charisma, Auer was elusive. Some biographers suggest he had long-term romantic companions, but chose not to formalize relationships due to the instability of his lifestyle and career. His bachelorhood affected his image in Hollywood. He was always cast as the oddball, eccentric foreigners, comic relief, or theatrical bohemians. Rarely was he given the chance to play romantic leads or emotionally grounded characters. In the eyes of the studio, he was funny, but not marketable as a husband or father figure. As the industry shifted in the late 1940s, Auer's brand of comedy fell out of style. He moved to Europe, where he found more freedom as a performer and less pressure to conform. Still, he never entered a public relationship or tied the knot. Auer's refusal to marry may have contributed to his typecasting, keeping him from deeper or more varied roles. But it also gave him autonomy. He answered to no one and avoided the studio-controlled marriages that entangled many of his peers. Misha Auer lived and died as he acted, delightfully off-center, unpredictable, and entirely on his own terms. His bachelorhood wasn't a secret. It was his freedom in a world that tried to put everyone in a box. Billy DeWolf. Billy DeWolf was one of those performers you couldn't forget. With his prim mustache, theatrical delivery, and razor-sharp timing, he was a mainstay in 1940s and 50s comedies. Whether playing a fussy dance instructor or a snooty hotel manager, DeWolf had a knack for stealing scenes. But when the cameras stopped rolling, he retreated into a world he kept fiercely private. He never married and never intended to. Off-screen, DeWolf was known for being reserved, bookish, and deeply committed to his work. Friends and collaborators have long suggested he was gay, though he never publicly addressed his orientation. He lived discreetly in an era where flamboyance was allowed on screen, but condemned in real life. DeWolf's bachelor status impacted his career in subtle but telling ways. He was rarely, if ever, considered for romantic roles. Studios saw him as a character actor, perfect for comic relief or the overbearing boss, but not someone audiences would root for in matters of love. He embraced this niche, creating a persona that became iconic, the comic spinster in male form. Despite the lack of romantic visibility, DeWolf found consistent work and was beloved by audiences. Yet his legacy is tinged with what-ifs. Had he lived in a more accepting time, he might have played more diverse roles, or shared more of himself with the public. DeWolf once said in an interview, "I act, I read, and I collect hats. I'm quite happy." That summed up his bachelorhood: peaceful, private, and perhaps protective. But it also meant that behind every laugh he delivered, there was a man who lived in the margins, carefully guarding the parts of himself Hollywood wouldn't accept. Lou Costello. Lou Costello, one half of the legendary comedy duo Abbott and Costello, brought laughter to millions with routines like, "Who's on first?" But behind the slapstick and squeaky voice charm was a deeply sensitive man whose private heartbreak left lasting scars. While some mistakenly believed he was married, Costello never legally wed. His long-term partner was a constant presence, but their relationship never became official. Costello's aversion to marriage stemmed partly from grief. In 1943, at the height of his career, his infant son, Lou Jr., tragically drowned in their home swimming pool just days before his first birthday. The loss devastated Costello. Friends say he was never the same after that day. He threw himself into work, sometimes doing multiple shows a day, but the pain lingered. Though he remained with the child's mother, the trauma reportedly drove a wedge between them, preventing a traditional family unit from forming. Costello, already a private man, became even more emotionally guarded. He never remarried or pursued another long-term romance. In terms of career, Costello's bachelor-like status wasn't as heavily scrutinized as others, thanks to his clownish persona. Studios sold him as the lovable loser rather than the dashing lead, so questions about his personal life were few. But it also meant he was boxed in. Forever the funny man, never the romantic. His on-screen innocence belied a personal life steeped in sorrow. Remaining unmarried allowed Costello to avoid further emotional entanglement, but it also left him isolated. In his final years, he was reportedly reclusive and weighed down by health issues and regrets. Lou Costello's bachelorhood wasn't born of preference, it was born of pain. It was the silent wound beneath the laughs and the price he paid for a loss no success could ever repair. Raymond Burr. To millions, Raymond Burr was the face of justice. Whether as Perry Mason, the indomitable defense attorney, or Ironside, the tough detective in a wheelchair. But behind his stern demeanor was a man who carried a fabricated personal history and never married. Burr went to great lengths to appear conventional, even inventing a dead wife and a non-existent son for press interviews. The truth was far more complicated. Burr was a closeted gay man during a time when such a revelation would have ended his career. His longtime partner, actor Robert Benavides, was part of his life for over 3 decades. They shared homes, a vineyard, and a deep bond, but never publicly acknowledged their relationship during Burr's lifetime. Remaining unmarried was a necessity. The illusion of a grieving widower allowed Burr to deflect questions about his romantic life and focus on his work. It also helped preserve his marketability as a leading man, especially in television's golden era. Yet living a double life came at a personal cost. Burr was generous, philanthropic, and deeply loyal, but also intensely private and emotionally compartmentalized. Colleagues admired his professionalism, but often sensed a wall he never let down. His bachelorhood, though by design, became a lifelong performance, one as complex and layered as the characters he portrayed. And unlike his courtroom dramas, the verdict on his real life remained sealed until after his death. In later years, Burr lived more freely, though never publicly out. He died with Benavides at his side, and only then did the truth begin to emerge. For Burr, bachelorhood was never about solitude. It was about survival in a system that punished authenticity. Edward G. Robinson Jr. Edward G. Robinson Jr. grew up in the enormous shadow of his father, the iconic star of Little Caesar and Double Indemnity. Unlike his father, Robinson Jr. never reached A-list status. He bounced between B-movies, stage work, and personal demons. What made him stand out, though, was his refusal to marry, even as Hollywood and his family pressured him to settle down. Robinson Jr. lived a tumultuous life marked by alcohol abuse, financial instability, and chronic legal troubles. He was arrested several times, including for check fraud and public drunkenness. His relationships were brief, stormy, and mostly hidden from the press. Those who knew him described him as charming, but deeply troubled. Friends speculated that Robinson Jr. didn't marry because he never felt worthy of the Robinson name. Living under his father's fame made every personal failure feel amplified. He struggled to maintain stable relationships and often withdrew when intimacy became too real. In the 1950s and 60s, when second-generation actors were expected to carry the torch, Robinson Jr.'s bachelorhood raised eyebrows. Studios couldn't market him as a romantic lead, and his off-screen volatility made him difficult to insure or promote. His bachelor status, far from glamorous, became a symbol of his detachment. It reflected a man who couldn't find stability, emotionally, professionally, or romantically. Edward G. Robinson Jr. died young at 40, leaving behind a name but not a legacy. His bachelorhood wasn't a statement. It was a symptom of a life spent in quiet conflict, always in the shadow, never in the light. Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton was technically married to actress Elsa Lanchester, but the nature of their relationship was anything but traditional. Though married for over 30 years, Laughton's homosexuality was an open secret within industry circles, and their union was widely regarded as a companionship of convenience. For this reason, many historians and biographers categorize Laughton among Hollywood's most famous married bachelors. Laughton was a brilliant actor, best known for The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mutiny on the Bounty, and Witness for the Prosecution. His performances were thunderous and unforgettable, but his personal life was carefully concealed. He and Lanchester lived in separate spaces, and she later confirmed in interviews that their marriage was platonic. He feared that revealing his true self would destroy his career. As a result, Laughton spent his life balancing two acts, one on screen and one in private. His bachelor-like existence limited his social engagement within Hollywood's elite circles and cut him off from meaningful emotional intimacy. Laughton's pain often surfaced in his characters. They were intense, brooding, conflicted, and that was no accident. Behind every role was a man deeply familiar with suppression. Despite public success, he lived a life of quiet isolation. His story reminds us that marriage, especially in old Hollywood, wasn't always what it seemed. Charles Laughton may have worn a ring, but emotionally and romantically, he lived like a lifelong bachelor. Frank Fay. Frank Fay is largely forgotten today, but in the 1920s and early 1930s, he was one of the most famous entertainers in America. A vaudeville master and early film actor, Fay never married, unless you count his doomed, abusive relationship with actress Barbara Stanwyck, which was annulled quickly and left behind no formal union. The marriage was so brief and toxic that even contemporary biographers describe Fay as having lived most of his life alone. He was hailed as the man who invented the modern stand-up comedy style, blending monologue, insult humor, and off-the-cuff timing. But Fay's arrogance and alcoholism alienated nearly everyone he worked with. He was a notorious control freak, known for humiliating cast members and studio execs alike. His inability to maintain romantic or professional relationships stemmed from a volatile personality. His bachelorhood became a shield against vulnerability. He didn't marry because no one could stand him for long. Fay's personal demons decimated his once dazzling career. By the 1940s, he was unemployable. He died virtually penniless and alone in 1961, a tragic irony for a man who once headlined the biggest stages. His story is a cautionary tale. Success can isolate as much as failure. And when ego builds the walls, bachelorhood isn't freedom, it's exile. John Hall. John Hall, the square-jawed star of adventure films like The Hurricane and Arabian Nights, was the epitome of masculine glamour. He battled pirates, conquered jungles, and romanced beautiful women on screen. But off-screen, Hall lived a surprisingly private and solitary life. He never married, and his romantic life remained a mystery. He had several rumored affairs with co-stars and starlets, but none led to engagement or marriage. Friends described Hall as kind but emotionally distant, a man more comfortable with adventure than intimacy. Some suspected he harbored his own secrets, possibly around his identity and sexuality, though he never publicly addressed them. Hollywood struggled to classify him. He wasn't quite a leading man, nor a supporting actor, and without the benefit of a high-profile marriage, studios couldn't use his personal life for publicity. That lack of manufactured romance likely hindered his rise during a time when tabloids could build or break careers. Later in life, Hall was diagnosed with incurable cancer. Rather than suffer through the decline, he took his own life in 1979. He left behind a career of swashbuckling roles and a personal life forever shrouded in shadows. His bachelorhood wasn't scandalous, but it was curious. John Hall died as he lived, dashing, reserved, and unreachable. Franklin Farnum. Franklin Farnum was one of the most prolific background actors in Hollywood history. With over 300 film credits, from silent westerns to bit roles in classics like Sunset Boulevard, Farnum was always there, but never quite seen. And while Hollywood changed dramatically during his 50-year career, one thing never changed. Farnum never married. Born in 1878, he came to Hollywood from the vaudeville circuit. He arrived alone, stayed alone, and left no family behind. There's no record of serious relationships, public romances, or companionship. In a city built on illusion, Farnum's life was the ultimate mystery. His bachelorhood was perhaps a reflection of his priorities. He worked constantly, not for fame, but for survival. As the roles got smaller, his reliability kept him employed. Studios respected his discretion and work ethic, even if they didn't know much else. Farnum's lack of romantic life meant he was never drawn into scandals or headlines, but it also meant he remained invisible. When he passed away in 1961, he left behind no estate, no heirs, just a long list of movie credits and a worn cowboy hat. His story is one of quiet endurance. For Franklin Farnum, bachelorhood wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the cost of giving everything to a dream that never quite gave back. Percy Kilbride. As the slow-talking Pa Kettle in the popular Ma and Pa Kettle series, Percy Kilbride charmed audiences with his laid-back humor and gentle demeanor. But the real Kilbride was nothing like his screen persona. He was serious, reclusive, and completely unmarried. He never married or had children and rarely granted interviews. Even his co-stars knew little about his life off set. Kilbride disliked Hollywood parties and avoided the social scene. He was rumored to be gay, but never confirmed or denied it. Instead, he retreated into anonymity between roles, often disappearing into the California countryside. Kilbride's refusal to marry or play the publicity game contributed to his typecasting. While he was beloved as Pa Kettle, he was never offered roles that deviated from that folksy comedic mold. He eventually retired early, citing a desire for peace and privacy. He died in 1964 after being struck by a car in a tragic accident. Alone to the end, Kilbride was mourned quietly, just the way he might have wanted. His bachelorhood was a reflection of a deeper truth. Percy Kilbride didn't want fame. He just wanted to work, retreat, and be left alone. And that's exactly how he lived. Arthur Treacher. Arthur Treacher became the go-to English butler in classic Hollywood films. With his towering height, stiff upper lip, and dry wit, he played valet to everyone from Shirley Temple to Bing Crosby. Yet behind that dignified presence was a man who never married, never flaunted companionship, and left no heirs. Born in England, Treacher came to America for the stage and stayed for the silver screen. Despite his fame, he lived a modest life, often alone in his Hollywood bungalow. He never publicly discussed his private affairs, but many believed he remained single due to his sexual orientation and the pressures of public life. His lack of romantic attachments suited the roles he was known for: loyal, reserved, proper. But it also meant he was never considered for more dynamic characters. He became a caricature of himself, the always available servant with no story of his own. Later in life, Treacher became the face of a popular fish and chips chain. Yet even in commercials, he played a version of the butler. His real life remained tucked away, structured, polished, and profoundly private. Arthur Treacher's bachelorhood wasn't mysterious. It was disciplined, perhaps even protective. In his world, service to the audience came before service to self. Grady Sutton. Grady Sutton made a career playing the affable sidekick, the awkward suitor, or the clueless cousin in hundreds of films from the 1930s through the 1950s. You may not know his name, but his face is forever linked to golden-era comedies, and he never married. Sutton lived a quiet, unassuming life. He was gay, though never publicly out, and lived with male companions throughout his later years. His bachelorhood was never questioned in the press because he wasn't a leading man. He was the comic foil, the guy who never got the girl on screen, which matched his real life. This absence of marital pressure allowed him freedom, but limited his opportunities. Studios liked him in small doses. He was funny, likable, but not promotable as a star. So Sutton settled into a life of consistency, bit parts, friendships, and a modest home filled with books and memories. When he passed away in 1995, it was in quiet dignity, just as he had lived. Grady Sutton's bachelorhood wasn't scandal or tragedy, it was simply his way. And in an industry built on illusion, that kind of honesty was rare. In an era when appearances meant everything, these 23 Golden Age actors lived beyond the spotlight's reach, alone, unseen, or quietly resisting Hollywood's rules. Their bachelorhood was not just a personal status, but a powerful, often painful reflection of how little room the Golden Age allowed for real human complexity behind the camera.